scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. In episodes 8 and 9, I covered Danish and Norwegian variants of the Younger Futhark, describing the developments in those dialects of Old West Norse. In today's episode, let's catch up with the developments in Old East Norse, the language that eventually became Old Swedish and Old Gutnish, or the language spoken on Gotland. I described in our last two episodes how the regular R sound of the rune Reið and the ending R sound of the rune Yr merged early in Norwegian dialects of Old West Norse. The distinction between these sounds persisted in Sweden, where they spoke Old East Norse. These two separate sounds, one an R, as we normally think of it, and the other either a Z or a palatal R, j sound, definitely appeared distinct from each other well into the Swedish Viking Age at a usage distribution that is similar to that of pre-Viking Age forms of the language. So the Ir did not evolve into a Y sound in Sweden, like it did in Norway, until the medieval period, and definitely after the close of the Viking Age. One change that we do see in Sweden, however, is the use of the star form of the h-rune for a fricative G sound, like the modern Greek gamma, or the G spoken in the Spanish word amigo. This trend seems to have evolved in Uppland during the Viking Age. Scholars have various explanations for how this usage evolved. In the early 20th century, Otto von Friesen tried to connect this to the Anglo-Saxon use of the star rune for gera, which is also a fricative G, which he said was imported to Sweden by the rune carver Osmund Korason, whom von Friesen connected to the English missionary bishop Osmundus, who was described by Adam of Bremen. But Thompson rejected this fairly tenuous argument in 1975. Just because somebody's named Osmund doesn't mean that all Osmunds are the same Osmund. Spurkland, in his doctoral dissertation, argued for it being a native development between Proto-Scandinavian and Old Norse, but no rune writers in Sweden used a star rune for a fricative G before the beginning of the 11th century. Magnus Källström pointed out that the stung kaun rune fulfilled the same function, but suggested that either this practice of using the star rune actually predates the introduction of the stung runes in the late 900s, and the inscriptions simply haven't survived yet for us to have recovered, or that the use of the star rune for the fricative G developed in areas where the stung or dotted runes were not yet used, such as in the provinces of Norrland, where stung or dotted runes were unknown during the Viking Age. If you're wondering about what stung or dotted runes are, check out my last episode. We don't yet have enough data to support a specific chronology for this use of the star rune before the 11th century as a fricative G, but we do know that the spelling spread to Orkney, the Faroes, and Greenland, where it was used in at least one inscription. So, if the dialect of Old Norse is different to that spoken in Denmark and Norway, what else might be unique about Swedish runic usage during the Viking Age? When I introduced the distinction between long twig and short twig runes, where rune writers chose to shorten the length of the stroke or the twig, which comes off of the upright or the stave of the rune, I mentioned that these short twig runes were more common in Norway and Sweden than in Denmark, and that is the case, but I think you'll be surprised by the statistics. In present-day Sweden, there are only about 40 inscriptions in short twig futhark, which can be dated to the 9th or 10th centuries, and 30 of these are rune stones. The short twig inscriptions are distributed throughout the country, and they appear slightly more frequently in certain areas, such as Östergötland, Gotland, and in Uppland. The short twig inscriptions on movable objects, shown here in red, have approximately the same distribution as the runestones, and Gotland contains about a third of the inscriptions overall. Inscriptions with only long twig runes, however, were rare in Sweden during this period, relatively early, and there are very few runestones, only about 10, that are carved purely in long twig runes. Exclusively long twig inscriptions almost always appear in coastal areas and never in the interior where short twig runes appear. Both variants appeared among the movable object inscriptions recovered from the trading port at Birka in Mälaren between about 750 to 970 of the Common Era. This first Birka inscription begins with a U and then a short twig A here and a short twig S. And then later on in the inscription we have a short twig N as well. This second inscription on a Viking Age bronze sheet has long twig A's here and here, and in this part of the inscription there is a nasal A or O's rune, and the alternate transliterations here are from Helmer Gustafsson from 2002, and then the second one is Sofia Peresvetov Moraths from 2021. And while they disagree over some of the runes in the inscription, they don't disagree on these two runes. So the coexistence of long twig and short twig runes in the same space would parallel finds at Heiteby in Denmark, from which we recovered two rune sticks that I mentioned in episode 8, which were inscribed in short twig runes, when most contemporary Danish inscriptions were in long twig runes. Short twig and long twig runes even mixed within the same inscription. This early Viking Age inscription from Höga in Bohuslän has a short twig T and a short twig N, but we have long twig variants of the M rune in two instances, and then the ending R is long twig as well. Mixed inscriptions like this are rare overall in Viking Age Sweden, but were very common specifically in provinces within the Swedish region of Norrland. In Hälsingland, Medelpad, and Jämtland, rune writers used mostly long twig runes, but with A, N, S, and T written in their short twig forms. I'll show you a Futhark rune row that we could use for that in a little bit. The lack of punctuation dividing words within the inscriptions typically found in Norrland was an archaism by the Viking Age, so perhaps we should understand these Norrland inscriptions as a throwback to an older form. But the relatively sparse survival of inscriptions from before the year 1000 makes it difficult to be confident that we can necessarily see a trend here, but we definitely have short twig or long twig runes, or mix the two, depending upon where in Sweden we are. But what did Swedish futharks actually look like when they're all written together as a rune row? On this comb from Årsta in Södermanland and dated to the 11th century, there were originally 3 different partial futharks, which together make up nearly a full rune row. We can observe here a long twig futhark that looks very similar to the 9th century composite futhark we built when discussing Norwegian Younger Futhark. Then we have another futhark on a horn shaft dated to 1100 to 1125 of the Common Era, again in long twig runes. We also have a full futhark on a later bone fragment from Sigtuna, dated to the last quarter of the 12th century. The N and the I runes have changed places in this inscription, and the piece is broken towards the end. But I wanted to include it because it shows a different O, or nasal A, rune to the other rune rows. And then this medieval sandstone tool for grinding grain also has a futhark around its outer edge, again in long twig runes. So if we compare known Swedish rune row futharks side by side, we can observe that some runes that became common or standard in both Denmark and Norway also appear in Sweden, like the star rune for H, this form of the N and the A, and this M rune as well. We can also see several different variations for the O or the nasal A rune, but by and large, long twig runes are the dominant futhark in Sweden after the end of the 10th century. These last three runes on the Bultarbokvern are Orlager, Tvimader, and Belgtorn. These three runes plus the 16 rune Younger Futhark make up the so-called golden numbers used in the runic calendar, or a version of the runic calendar, and linked to the 19-year cycle of the moon in relation to the solar calendar, also called the Metonic cycle. If you're interested in runic calendars, I highly recommend the work of Rune Hjarno Rasmussen. If we look at runic usage overall, without looking for full futhark rune rows, we can observe that, like in Norway, rune writers in early and mid Viking Age Sweden chose a much greater variety of runes and experimented more than rune writers in Denmark. There are therefore more variations of short twig Younger Futhark characters. We've seen this A and this B before, but this T and this L short twig rune are both new in Sweden, and they're very unique to Sweden. Towards the end of the 10th century, however, the relative paucity of inscriptions changed in an explosion of rune writing that survives for us to read, which is fantastic. Long twig runes become dominant in Sweden at that point, though some short twig forms persist even in long twig inscriptions, and these are the best runes to be using in their short twig forms when otherwise appearing in a long twig inscription. The switch to long twig runes from the short twig runes originated in Denmark, where Christian runic inscriptions had begun to flourish. From Denmark, they spread north to Sweden after the year 1000, along with the Danish long twig runes, which almost completely dominated inscriptions around the Mälar Valley. If we could return to the rune row from the Sigtuna Hornshaft just quickly, what's especially interesting about it is that on another face of the shaft, there appear a type of runes called Staveless runes. So let's talk about this important experiment in Swedish futharks, or at least unique. Staveless runes developed in the late 10th and early 11th centuries by, for the most part, removing the vertical line, or stave, that anchors most of the other runes of the Younger Futhark. And you can see the ultimate product of what this looks like in the runes here on the Malsta runestone. The historian Magnus Celsus was able in 1675 to decode that the reader interprets the rune based on the twig's relative position to the upper and lower outlines that contain the text. You'll notice that each one of these is inside of a swirly dragon-looking character. These runes appear on a handful of runestones from Hälsingland, Södermanland, and occasionally in Medelpad, all of these being in eastern Sweden. And Staveless runes also appear on movable artifacts from Uppland, but only about 3 of them, and on a stick from Bergen in Norway that is otherwise pretty complex to read, and not many scholars agree on exactly what it says. Everywhere but in Helsingland, the Staveless runes appear in an inscription mixed with other Younger Futhark runes. So only in Helsingland do they show up completely on their own, which is why sometimes they're called Helsinge runes. The form of specific Staveless runes varies considerably, but here is a rune row synthesized from the inscriptions around Helsingland, where they are most numerous. The most obvious reason one can think of for why the Staveless runes developed would be the speed with which they can be written as an everyday script, but there are 2 problems with this argument. The first is that they are slower to interpret and the probability for misinterpretation much greater than with runes that do contain a stave. The second is their greater incidence of survival on stone, which takes them a lot longer to carve, than their survival on rune sticks, where one would expect a faster system to have been used for more day-to-day communication on a relatively disposable medium. Overall, the experiment seems to have been both relatively local and of a short duration, with not a large overall impact overall on the development of mainstream runic writing in Scandinavia, but it's unique and graphically very interesting and really bears talking about. So what did the Swedes call their runes? We might initially want to look at the Old Swedish rune poem, but it is actually the youngest of the surviving rune poems, having been recorded right around the year 1600, which is pretty late. While the Old Swedish rune poem could possibly have derived from the older tradition of the Norwegian rune poem, Aurendkvak considered the poem's language too corrupted to be able to trace a medieval source. So, if you're looking for what Swedish Vikings called their runes, this particular rune poem would not be a reliable narrator. So let's revisit its rune names in a later episode on medieval runes. The Swedes did, however, have an effect on runes as they expanded eastwards, down the Volga and the Don rivers of what is now Russia, to found the Principality of Kiev, extending through both modern Russia and Ukraine. So let's talk about the runes of the Kievan Rus in our next episode. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.